a very warm welcome to this introductory session on negotiation and women leaders. My name is Paul Fisher. I'm Program Director of the Oxford Program on Negotiation, an Associate Fellow at Side Business School, and I also teach on a number of other programs at the school, including a brilliant program called Women Transforming Leadership, which is actually its next iteration is starting next week. And I'd also like to introduce some of my colleagues. Owen Derbyshire, the Academic Director of the Oxford Programme of Negotiation, a professor at the Business School, who's going to talk to you. We're jointly going to do our session today. And also Christine Homoki. Christine is in charge. She's a programme consultant and in charge of the Oxford Programme on Negotiation and the Women Transforming Leadership. So she can answer any questions you might have on both those programmes. So really great to be here. I appreciate we can't make this session too interactive with so many people, but please feel free to use the chat. It's great to get your different insights, your perspectives. If you're brave enough to come off mute and speak, that's fine as well. So we'll try and make this session as interactive as possible. So what I want to do to start with, just to get you in that negotiation frame of mind, is I have a very simple poll, if you wouldn't mind putting up. And this essentially is, how often do you negotiate? How often do you negotiate? So John, brilliant. Thank you very much. Is it occasionally, every month, every week, or every day? And what would be great is if you could possibly just put in the chat some of the typical negotiations you undergo. I mean, you've probably done a negotiation today already. So just what are your typical negotiations? And I'll just give a few seconds for you to answer that and answer your question in the chat. What are your typical every day with your husband, Anne? Is he a tough negotiator? Children, absolutely. Rachel, getting your son dressed in the morning. I feel your pain. Well, my son is now 18, but when he was a lot younger, yeah, negotiating with children is a really tough thing to do. And I think with children, actually, it's not always negotiation. I think there's probably a little bit of coercion and manipulation involved there as well with clients and managers. Brilliant. So essentially, I would argue that you negotiate all the time. Now, when we think of negotiation, we think often of the big high-level negotiations, trade agreements, mergers and acquisitions, climate change negotiations, peace treaties. Hopefully at some stage we'll get a negotiated end to some of these terrible conflicts around the world. And then, of course, we have negotiations which we encounter occasionally in our life, buying and selling a house, cars, negotiating with our families. And then, of course, negotiation is really prominent in our careers as well. It could be anything from an external negotiation with a supplier to negotiating budgets, negotiating resources, and of course, negotiating on behalf of yourself as well in terms of salaries, working conditions. So the bottom line is that negotiation is one of the preeminent processes when it comes, I believe, to managing your careers and in leadership as well. So my second question is, how much do you enjoy negotiating? Do you love it? Does the adrenaline start flowing? Or do you find negotiation, I don't know, a little bit like going to the dentist or something? Is it something it's an ordeal that you kind of would like to finish as soon as possible? So how much do you enjoy negotiating? And feel free to put any additional comments on that poll in the chat as well. How much do you enjoy it? And the reason I ask that question is for those of you, and we'll share the results in a minute, for those of you who don't enjoy negotiating, you're not alone. The research shows that a lot of people, in particular women actually, find negotiation to be a kind of a stressful experience. Why? Well, there's a number of reasons. There's this idea that negotiation is adversarial. It can impact relationships. And one of the things we're going to be talking about a little bit today is, and particularly Owen is going to talk about, is the fact that women actually often feel more comfortable negotiating on behalf of other people or their organizations rather than themselves. And one of the objectives of this session today, thank you very much for sharing the results. As I can see, quite a lot of people find it quite a stressful experience. But one of the objectives of today, and there's basically two objectives, is firstly, to argue that negotiation doesn't have to be like that. It doesn't have to be adversarial, and it should be a collaborative process. And the second thing, which I think is really important, is a lot of negotiation is about confidence. So whatever your gender, anxious negotiators don't tend to be very effective negotiators. The heart starts racing, you feel uncomfortable, you ask for too little, you compromise on your goals, and you start conceding too much or too soon. You just want the whole ordeal to be over. And expectations often drive behavior. So if we expect to do badly, we'll probably end up with a poor performance. So if you can change expectations, if you can increase confidence, you can change outcomes. So what we're going to do today in this 60 minutes is we're going to look at some of the research. So Owen's going to look at the research. What is that telling us about why is there a difference? And then based on that, I'm going to talk a little bit about 6 key principles, 6 key ways that you can be a more effective negotiator. And then following that, if we've got enough time, we're very happy to answer any questions you might have as well. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Owen to tell you a little bit about some of the fascinating research related to gender and negotiation.
Thanks very much indeed, Paul, and from me as well. Just welcome to everybody here, and it's great to see so many people from so many different parts of the world. Many of whom I think should be asleep given the timing that we're doing this and the countries that you're from. One of the things that just came out with the chat there is, of course, people recognizing many different types of negotiation, different structures of negotiation that exist. And to a large extent, what I'm going to do is I'm going to obviously, in a very short period of time, give you a fairly superficial overview of what some of the findings are for the impact of gender in negotiations. There's a lot more sort of detail. There's a lot of subtlety in it, and so I'm going to just be talking about the overarching conclusions that we find. But hopefully you'll find what we've got both from the empirical findings that I'm going to look at, and then subsequently the tools, something that can be beneficial to you and a starting point for thinking how to be more effective for yourselves. So with that, the question obviously to start with is, do gender differences exist in negotiation? And the answer to that is yes. As Paul has already sort of said, one of the challenges that people experience is that they think of negotiation as being a very sort of competitive, assertive, adversarial interaction, and and I'll come back to this, which might be seen as a sort of a more, quote, masculine activity, that sort of competitive aggressiveness associated with it. And what we're going to talk about is that actually that really isn't the most effective way to be a negotiator, and that what successful negotiators typically do is they focus on something quite different, which is about mutual problem solving. And part of the challenge that many people face, male and female, is how they're conceiving of negotiation in the first instance. And if you're conceiving it as something that is competitive and aggressive, then actually one of the challenges is to change that mindset so that we think of it as something a little bit different. In terms of gender differences, there is really very little evidence at all of difference in ambition when negotiating on behalf of the self or negotiating on behalf of organizations. So if there are gender differences, they don't seem to come from that side. And interestingly, as Paul sort of said, when we look at the effectiveness of men or women when negotiating on behalf of others, so for your team within your organization or for your organization when interacting with other organizations, there's absolutely no difference of women being less effective, less successful, or anything like that. So gender differences don't appear to exist in that setting. But what we do observe is that there are some gender differences that exist when negotiating on behalf of oneself. So women, when negotiating for themselves, are less likely to initiate those negotiations. And there are going to be some caveats that come up with this. There are also, in a range of different spheres, evidence that women get slightly worse results when negotiating on behalf of themselves. And we're going to need to think about why that is and what steps can be taken to eliminate those differences. We don't want to exaggerate how big those differences are. They've certainly fallen over time, but they still do exist. If we look at some area like housing, for example, the purchase and sale of houses, a very large data set from the US shows that women tend to get slightly less when selling a house, or pay slightly more than men do when buying a house. And if you're the seller, then again, a woman tends to get slightly worse outcomes than men do. In salary negotiations, in job assignments, there are also some differences that come up. But context does matter. And what we're going to come back to later is that there are challenges that women experience in career negotiations that men don't face in the same way, or they don't face some of those challenges, but certainly not to the same extent. But also, the differences that occur in negotiating on behalf of the self are much more likely to be evident when there is ambiguity about what can be negotiated, who you're negotiating with. Where ambiguity doesn't exist, so for example, if a job negotiation sort of says the salary is negotiable, then actually we see few gender differences. If that's not declared in advance, so this is the salary, then actually men are more likely to initiate a negotiation about than women are. And only if you initiate a negotiation, of course, are you going to get a higher outcome. It's also important what perceptions are of the relevance of gender. And that's something that I'm going to come back to because it's extremely important. And it's the perceptions that others have of the relevance of gender in that particular situation. So what do we see in terms of gender and expectations? Well, one of the challenges that exists is generalized patterns of difference in socialization. Okay, so we're talking generally here, we're talking averages, but by and large, boys tend to be socialized still to be somewhat more agentic. And what we mean by that is focusing on themselves, individualistic, so a little bit more competitive, assertive. Girls tend to be socialized to be a little bit more focused on a broader set, a community, to be less self-interested, but to care more about others as well. And those different patterns of socialization then affect what behaviors some people are looking at. Now, of course, even if it was the case that the current generation are not being socialized in that way, many people, of course, who are in the workplace now, who are in senior leadership positions, who might be, let's say in their late 40s, early 50s, were socialized quite a long time ago. And so these patterns have long lag effects. And the question is, if you've got this different pattern of expectations, that men, it's all right if they're agentic, girls, women should be more communal, care about others, then that can affect people's reactions to the behavior that is exhibited. So one of the big challenges that women can face when negotiating on behalf of themselves is a fear of a backlash. Okay, so the fear is that if a woman goes forward and so tries to push for, let's just keep this simple, as a higher salary, then the question then is, what is the reaction that is going to come from those she's negotiating with, the boss, the others in the organization, about this push for the higher salary? Because pushing for yourself to getting a higher pay rate doesn't fit with this socialization pattern that girls, that women should be focused more communally, focused on the benefit for others as well. It fits fine with the male socialized pattern of being agentic, of being interested in oneself and being more assertive and competitive. But what happens for the woman? What's the reaction? And the risk is that women are then perceived as less likable. And the question is, if this fear exists, is it real? And does it affect behavior? And the answer is to both of those, yes. Now, this is just one very quick small chart just to try to give a visual illustration to you amongst the plenty of the research that exists. But what you see is on the left-hand side where it says self, this and the vertical axis here is about when does a backlash occur? If somebody is quite aggressive in demanding a much higher salary, do people stop and go, whoa, what are you doing? Why are you pushing for so much? You're a little bit pushing a little bit too hard. Does that backlash that comes occur at the same level of demand from a man or a woman? And what you see on the very far left is what is the salary in this experimental work that comes with a man, and it's over 50,000 in this particular set of experiments, where it occurs much lower for a woman. In other words, that fear that there might be a social backlash occurs at an earlier stage. On the other, the one that is labeled other on the right-hand pair of charts, are what happens if you're negotiating on behalf of others. So this could be a team member within your organization. I'm pushing for them to get some new, a higher salary, a bonus, a better project assignment, or something like that. Or I'm negotiating on behalf of the organization as a whole. I'm representing my organization interacting with another. Is there then a difference in the backlash that occurs, this feeling that women are not likable or competent? And the answer is no, there's no difference at all there. So there is a different reaction that comes to the same set of behaviors when they're exhibited by men and women, of whether they're for the self or whether they're negotiating on behalf of others. So the question then is, if this fear is indeed warranted, and I'm saying that it does, what does this lead to? Well, it leads to women being less likely to initiate a negotiation, particularly if there's uncertainty about what that negotiation is, whether it's sort of permissible, if you like. Because the conundrum that a woman might face that a man doesn't is that they will be perceived as less likable within the organization. And so this sometimes leads to a sort of a dilemma for women that men don't face, which is what's sometimes called a competence likability conundrum. And how do you demonstrate both of them? So it's also the case that if women adopt the same style as men, and particularly if a man adopts an assertive style and a woman adopts an assertive style in pushing for them an increase for themselves, then the backlash that comes for women using that sort of slightly more competitive, aggressive style tends to be greater. So an assertive style leads to more of a backlash for women than it does for men. But again, negotiating on behalf of others or the organization does not appear to generate that backlash. And the question then is, well, why is that? Well, this notion of, quote, a mother bear might be best to illustrate that metaphorically, which is the idea that if the socialization pattern suggests that women should be communal, cared with the group interests, if you're representing a member of your team, if you're representing the organization as a whole and you're fighting hard for that, that's perfectly legitimate. That's expected, because that's what women are meant to be doing. They're fighting on behalf of others. So we've got a bit of a dilemma here. No difference in competence, no difference in skill, no difference in ambitions, but some challenges that women face that men don't. In organizational negotiations, we can also think about how context matters. Now, one of the critical things that I mentioned earlier is ambiguity. So where there is ambiguity about whether a negotiation is appropriate within an organization, then actually the gender differences are starker than they would be otherwise. What you'll sometimes see in organizations is that salary is negotiable, but nobody's mentioned whether the bonus is also negotiable as well. In which case, the woman will be more likely to initiate a negotiation on salary, but actually may well not do it with respect to the bonus, at least is less likely to do it than a man is. Where there is no ambiguity, then gender differences tend to disappear. And I'm going to come back to that in a moment. Gender differences also decline substantially when the woman is well known. In other words, if you're applying for a new job in particular, if the woman is not known to the organization, then actually these backlash effects can be greater. So, for example, let me give you an illustration of a study with MBA students where the MBA students had done an internship prior to their negotiation, so they were known within the organization, then they were treated as a known quantity. Whereas, and these stereotypes, these implicit biases that exist occur more where the individual is not known. There's also a tendency that women have to put a little bit more weight on social outcomes versus the purely economic outcomes that men tend to emphasize. Okay, so I think it's important then also to think about, what are the challenges that women may well face compared with men? Often within organizations, women tend to negotiate about equally to men. So there aren't those differences, but there are different sets of challenge that men face compared with the women face compared with men. And then the first important reflection for everybody is that the vast majority of negotiations that take place concerning yourself within an organization are actually not about compensation, but they're about the role, for example, that a people have got. 80% of negotiations, it's been estimated, are about things like the role. For example, project assignments. Now, those can matter enormously for career development and career progress. If there's ambiguity about what, how do I get given a new project, the project may well be really important to gain the experience so that you can progress within the organization. But nobody says to you that actually you should go and negotiate to get that project. You could push for yourselves, because getting that project will often be given to the person who's showing the most ambition for it. In other words, that's part of a negotiation. I would like this project. If it's ambiguous about how these projects are allocated, and men are slightly more likely to initiate a negotiation for themselves, then they're more likely to get the project assignments. Those then put them in a better position to get the career progression. And so those types of negotiation are then tend to be sometimes ambiguous. Even if they're not ambiguous, one of the challenges is that women will often have less access to the networks that are really important to gather the information about the project, to be able to negotiate and to be able to put forward the appropriate case. And the reason for that is very simply that many organizations still tend to be dominated a little bit at higher levels by men. A further career challenge is that women often find themselves negotiating about the different things than men because of segregations of gender, or the gender allocation of different roles. So, for example, we know that there is a massive difference empirically about who takes care of the children still. And so flexible working seems to be something that women, often face the challenge of needing to negotiate for to a much greater extent than men do. The challenge that women will often face is that patriarchal rules within many organizations mean that there isn't a clear rule about gaining, sort of having flexible work. So often women are negotiating separately or outside the standard organizational rules for that. When thinking about these types of careers negotiation, these 80% that are about the role, recognize firstly that they last a really extended period of time. And they actually require a lot of time of building up support to be able to get it. They're not one-on-one negotiations. You're building coalitions of support, and that's really critical. But also, they're not based around assertiveness and aggressiveness. They're based around problem solving and creativity. And Paul's going to talk more about the importance of that to be successful in negotiation. And these skills that are required to be successful in these types of negotiation are things that can be learned. And they don't, in other words, involve masculine competitiveness or aggressiveness. One other thing, though, just to emphasize on this masculinity of negotiations, is that if we look at ethical behavior in negotiations, on average, men are less ethical in negotiations than women are. And there's a lot of experimental work looking at this, but this is about being deceptive in a particular type of negotiation, and women tend to be less deceptive than men do. But in fact, men are more likely to be deceptive if they view negotiation as a masculine activity. If negotiations is part of a man's world, effective negotiations are men, that actually leads to a real problem, which is unethical behavior. And so I'll leave that with you as something to reflect on, and I'll hand back over to Paul.
Great, thank you very much, Owen. Some really great discussions in the chat. Owen, you might want to have a look at there's some very interesting questions related to what Sophie talked about. Is age an issue? Do you become more confident and assertive as a woman as you become more experienced during your career? We talk about power, a lot of really sort of different nuances in the chat. So really rich discussion there. So thank you very much for that. So now what I want to do now is, so Owen has talked a lot about some of the kind of research, and now I want to move that research and into talking about some really practical tools that you can use to be more effective negotiators. And what I've done is I've come up with 6 key principles, very effective principles, that many of these principles you probably already use, but you're not always aware that you are using them, that will make you a more effective negotiator. And the first one is essentially trying to change the frame in a negotiation. Many people react in a slightly negative way when you use the word negotiation. Just looking at some of your comments, Helena saying, "Oh, negotiation, I find it scary," and people sort of react slightly negatively to the word. They see it as almost like it's you against me. And what I'd encourage you to do is to see if you can change the frame of the negotiation where it's you and me working together to solve a joint problem. That idea of a joint problem solving approach. And the latter tends to get a very different emotional response. And the more you can position your negotiation as a communal problem-solving negotiation, the better. The research shows that women are more effective when they pair competencies with communal orientation. So how will my skills help my employer, my team, and others do better? So as Owen said, negotiation is not a masculine activity. It's about mutual problem solving. So let me give you a very simple example. My colleague, this is a fictional example, my colleague managed to get a really good job offer from another business school, but they really wanted to stay where they were at their existing business school. So what she did, she went to see the dean and she said, "Dean, I've got a bit of an issue here. I love my job, but we have a problem. I have just received another really attractive offer from a rival school, and I need your help. Can you help me figure out how I can stay here?" So essentially, you're making your problem their problem. So it becomes, rather than an I, it becomes a we. Now, Sheryl Sandberg, I don't know if anyone's read a brilliant book called Lean In about her challenges, obviously the former chief operating officer at Facebook, at Meta. And she put it very well when she said, "Think personally, but act communally." So, for example, instead of saying, getting an MBA is important for my development as a leader, you might want to frame your negotiation as, with my new leadership skills, I'll be able to handle more complex projects, enabling you and the rest of the team to focus on more strategic priorities and for the business to grow as a whole. So it's all about changing that frame, that psychological viewpoint through which you see the negotiation. There are also two complementary goals in almost any negotiation. There's the subjective value, how you feel about the negotiation, the relational aspect, the emotional aspect, and there's what we call the objective value, how you actually do, the actual terms of a negotiation. And both are responsible for a good outcome. So a very interesting piece of research from MIT in the US found that when negotiators feel good and they like the person they're negotiating with, they want to negotiate with that person again, when they do negotiate with that person again, they tend to increase the objective value as well. So if you feel good, if you feel like you've been treated fairly, if you feel like you've got a good relationship, that tends to transition into more positive objective results. So if you don't know the person, though, if you don't focus on that subjective element of the negotiation, the feelings, the knowledge of that person, then what you do is you tend to revert back or fall back on traditional stereotypes. Now, because he's a man, he'll be tougher, or because she's a woman, she's going to be more cooperative. So that's what my second principle is. Know who you're negotiating with. Share information about yourself. And it doesn't just have to be information about the negotiation. It can be some more personal information as well. Relationships and trust are the cornerstone of negotiations, finding things you have in common with each other. Obviously, these days, there's a huge amount of information out there. You only need to go to LinkedIn to find out potential commonalities. So I'd really encourage people to focus on that. My third principle, I'm gonna shape this with a question. How many of you tend to go into a negotiation with what we call position-led language? And by that, I mean words like red lines. I want this. We cannot accept this. My position is this. Well, if you do, you're not alone. Plenty of people do that. In fact, one of the most famous position-led speeches recently was Theresa May when she set out the government's negotiation strategy over Brexit in 2017. She did a very it was a landmark speech at Lancaster House, and it was full of positions. I want this. My position is this. We cannot accept that. That would be a red line for the UK. Was this helpful? No, it wasn't, because it boxed her in. It took away much of her flexibility in the negotiation, and inevitably these red lines started being shifting around, and it impacted her reputation. So this is my fourth principle. I think this is really important in negotiation. Focus on interest rather than positions. So position is your goal. This is what I want. Interests are the underlying concerns, the motivations, the beliefs that make up that goal. And you'd be amazed how often negotiators of both genders waste time arguing over who should get their way, whereas in successful negotiators, the really great negotiators, look beyond those positions to identify those interests. So don't discuss always what people want, ask why they want it. Put yourself in their shoes. Look at the issues at hand. What are their interests? What is going on? What is bringing them to the table? What pressures are they under? And you'd be surprised how often you might have seemingly incompatible positions, but compatible interests. And I can think of many great negotiators, well, particularly great woman negotiator, actually, who's no longer with us, but Madeleine Albright, the former US Secretary of State. She was very good at zeroing in on interests, particularly in those really, really tough negotiations when she was negotiating with some pretty tough men, Milosevic, Putin, to name a couple of examples. So that's my third principle. Okay, my fourth principle, I want you to imagine that you're in a salary negotiation. And you approach it something like this. You say, thank you for the time for meeting with me. I'd like to discuss a salary increase. And these are based on the fact how successful we've been as a company over the last year. And these are a number of reasons why I think, I deserve a salary increase. We've managed 3 key projects. Our team efficiency has increased by 20%. We as a team are meeting our targets. I, with the invaluable support of my team, has taken on new responsibilities. I'm mentoring new team members. I'm managing client relationships. Our client satisfaction surveys have gone up by 30%, and we've had a great year with a significant increase in revenue. Is that a good approach when you're going into a salary? Well, I would say that the answer is definitely yes. And this is the importance of justifications. Again, it's about the why rather than the what. So what I'd encourage you to do is always try and justify your offers. Demonstrate that your proposals are reasonable and appropriate. And of course, it's also a great way of avoiding that potential backlash effect, which Owen talked about, where you try and focus on the we rather than the me. So we had a great year rather than I had a great year. And in this way, through justifications, you're also, of course, focusing on those interests rather than positions. And there are two other really big benefits to justifications, particularly from a gender perspective. Firstly, the research shows it can help enormously with self-confidence. So if you have enough research when you go into a negotiation, justifications, you tend to be more confident. You tend to increase your goals as a result. The more data that is readily available, the more likely it is that women will increase their expectations. And the second benefit of justifications is that you're giving your counterpart all the reasons that they can take to their boss or their peers or their board to say why they should accept your proposal, your salary, your price, your deal, and why it's fair and reasonable compared to the alternatives. So an exercise I find particularly useful, we sometimes ask our students to do, is to try and write your counterpart's victory speech. I'll say that again. Try and write your counterpart's victory speech. It's a great way of putting yourself in their shoes. Okay, another question. How many of you, realistically, feel free to put this in the chat, set pretty ambitious goals in a negotiation? And if you don't, what holds you back? What are the kind of obstacles for being ambitious, for being aspirational in your negotiation? And that kind of links into my fifth principle and my penultimate principle. And this is the idea that firstly, you need to set goals. And secondly, I'd encourage you to try and be ambitious with your goals as well. Why are goals important? Well, they anchor the agreement. They provide a structure. They show to you what success looks like. I think it was Henry Kissinger who said, if you don't know where you're going, you'll end up on the road to nowhere. And this is really applicable in negotiations. But when it comes to goals, you're likely to have several objectives. So you need to prioritize. What must I have? What if I don't have this, I should probably walk away from the negotiation? What would I like to have? And then what I call the icing on the cake, what you'd like to have in an ideal world. And what I would argue here, and again, there is this gender dimension, is try and aim high. What would I like to have in the ideal world? In many cases, you can pursue goals that you thought were out of reach without provoking conflict, without straining relationships. But you must know what you want. And of course, the more you can justify your goals and the more, of course, you can frame your goals as well, the more effective you will be at the same time. And the research also shows that the more you tend to ask for in a negotiation, you tend to get as well. So it has a direct impact on your success in the negotiation. And as Owen says, a more assertive style and more ambition in terms of goals actually sometimes can increase the backlash. So that's why, again, it's important to frame the negotiation rather than I. Look for communal packaging. So rather than having to negotiate over one single issue, such as salary, try packaging together, bring different issues into the negotiation. Negotiating on one issue tends to be more adversarial than negotiating and framing a package of resources. And my final principle out of these 6 principles, and I think this is probably the most important principle when it comes not just to negotiation, but to leadership, to life in general, is the importance of listening. We have a brilliant former diplomat on our negotiation program, Cathy Ashton. She used to be the head of the European Union's foreign policy. And she says, the first thing she says, the most important skill she had as a negotiator, as a leader, was to listen. But the fact is, we're not terribly good at listening. Why? Well, there's a number of reasons. We tend to speak at 120 words a minute, but often we're thinking at about 600 words a minute. So we start beginning to think about what our answers are going to be, what email do I have to answer? And quite often we're just thinking about what we're going to say next. We tend to bring it back to us. And you'd be amazed, the people who you really hope will listen tend to be sometimes some of the worst listeners. So, for example, doctors. There was a 2018 study by the University of Florida, which estimated and found out how long doctors waited for a patient to explain their condition before they started interrupting and saying, this is what you need to do. And it was 11 seconds. So listening is really important. And what is good listening about? Well, it's a whole body language. It's about listening. This is the Chinese character for listening. I think it really symbolizes the importance of listening and how it's a complete discipline. You use your eyes, your ears, your heart. You use your ears to listen, not just to the words spoken, but to the tone, the pace, the emphasis, what emotions are being shown. You use your eyes to connect with the person. Obviously, that varies based on culture. And we use our mind and our heart to listen as well. So it's about being in the moment, nodding, catching the eye, paraphrasing, and trying to, and this is one of the hardest things, trying to suspend judgment. And the benefits are huge. I think in life in general, what we want most is to understand and to be understood. And listening is absolutely crucial to this. And you'd be amazed in a negotiation how much information you can get through proper listening. And even people looking at the chat, people who talk about the power imbalance, the people who don't want to negotiate, there's sometimes a reason why they don't want to negotiate. And if you listen and really try and put yourself in their shoes, maybe they might tell you a little bit more about where they're coming from and the pressures they're under. And linked to this is the idea of questioning. Questioning is really powerful as well because it's actually essentially it's an investment in the answer. So it's all part of listening. And the powerful questions are the ones that really probe. They elicit information. They explore new areas. They encourage innovation. It's a bit like seeking clarity. I don't know if you've ever been to the optician and you've got your glasses on and you keep getting different lenses put in and you're trying to read the bottom line X JK L12. It's trying to get that clarity with that bottom line. And so these are just some of the questions I'd recommend. Tell me what's on your agenda at the moment. How can we work together to find a solution? What would it take to this is actually an academic from Yale talks about this. It's this catalyst for creativity. It's showing that you don't have all the answers. It's showing humility, but what would it take to get this deal over the line? What would it take to encourage you to change my working conditions or my salary? Can you tell me more about this? It shows interest. You're properly listening to people. And the final thing I'd say is the what if question. And this is a hypothetical question, but it can be really powerful because it's a low risk experiment in a way. It's because it's only hypothetical. You can put it on the table, suggest something creative. What if we consider doing something a little bit different here? And because it's hypothetical, if it doesn't land well, you can just quietly take it back off the table and continue the conversation. So these are my 6 principles. I basically condensed a lot of stuff that we spend a week normally talking about negotiation on our program, but these 6 principles I think are absolutely crucial to negotiation and particularly to women leaders and their successes in negotiation. And the final thing I'd say, and this links into what Owen talked about, this idea of reducing ambiguity, is preparation. So the more you can prepare and reduce that ambiguity, the more effective you will be. So context really does matter. So know who the person you're negotiating with, know the issues and the norms within the organization. What are the patterns of influence? Can you increase your networks to ensure that you receive more varied viewpoints, more complete information? And if it is demonstrated that negotiation is expected or normal, as Owen mentions, any of those gender differences and reluctance to negotiate disappear. And of course, there's an onus on organizations to ensure that they create that unambiguous world as it is for you to try and reduce ambiguity yourself. And if you reduce ambiguity, the more confident you become as a negotiator. And before we just go to questions, I just want to finish by showing you some examples of some brilliant women negotiators from the world of diplomacy. Baroness Ashton, who I mentioned earlier, often she was negotiating, she negotiated with 28 all European Union foreign ministers were male at one stage. So she was quite literally the only woman in the room. And she was a brilliant negotiator, using all her skills in often incredibly difficult environments, negotiating with Iran over the nuclear deal and negotiating in Ukraine, negotiating with Serbia and Kosovo. Angela Merkel, I thought was a great negotiator. Many people who knew Angela Merkel said she normally used to speak about 20% of the time. She was a brilliant listener, and by understanding what people say and sometimes what people don't say can be really powerful. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the first woman to be elected head of state in an African country in Liberia, did a huge amount for women's rights, promoting peace, often through negotiation, a tireless advocate. And from the world of business, I have Amanda Blanc of Aviva. She's been enormously successful in restoring the fortunes of one of Europe's largest insurers. Margareta Della Valle of Vodafone, who was thrown in at the deep end and was negotiating £1 billion mergers within her first few months. She's recently negotiated to move away from the Italian market. And finally, Sheryl Sandberg. And I would recommend that her book Lean In is a terrific book in terms of talking about some of the challenges she faced in a fair kind of male dominant IT world. So that is six. That is a very quick overview of six really key principles. So what I'd like to do now is turn it over to you to see if you have any questions. I know there was a few questions in the chat. But so I think we could maybe go through some of these. I probably won't be able to have a chance to do all of them, but please get in touch with us on LinkedIn, and maybe we'll put together a kind of a Q&A document based on any questions we don't answer. But Owen, do you have a question we should looking at the Q&As?
I mean, just pulling a few of them together, just a couple of quick comments. Firstly, I think it's been observed, are women better listeners and so on. I think a lot the principles that Paul has been talking about are things that actually fit much more by building on the nature of sort of that communal stereotype, really understanding, rather than just pushing for them oneself. It's about understanding and problem solving and building something bigger. And that contrast, which was all picked up earlier, between this language of pushing and sort of problem solving and building, is a contrast that I think we want to make, so that we realize that actually that pushing is not the most successful way to achieve things in a negotiation for oneself or for the organization, for the team, and so on. And that's a really important factor to become a really successful negotiator. I mean, just one general comment. I mean, there's nothing I can do about the observations that both Paul and I are male. One of the things I think is really important is that men understand these dimensions as well, because there are a lot of changes that have to take place at the organizational level, rather than simply this being about women or something like that. Well, that's wrong. Organizations have to take responsibility to make sure that the policies that they've got in place are appropriate, and that they're not discriminatory, accidentally, perhaps, let alone intentionally, but that there isn't ambiguity about what sort of compensation, about project assignments, that the rules and so on that are associated with those are clear, and that they're allocated in an appropriate way. And so sort of leadership, I think, has to be a really important part that men and women take within organizations.
Thank you for that, Owen. Happy to, if anyone would like to take their mic off as well, but just going through some of the questions here. Gugchair, what practices can I do to be an active, good listener? I think you just have to practice. Just try, and it's not easy, and you'll know if you properly listen, because it's actually quite an exhausting exercise. But just try and sort of declutter your mind, try and suspend judgment, and just try and sort of, we're so keen on talking about us and what am I going to say next, what question, and you kind of forget the main focus, which should be the recipient who you're listening to. And embrace silence as well. Sometimes we spend so much time filling the airwaves, and I would encourage you to kind of let negotiations breathe a bit, allow time for reflection. And sometimes with silence, people start telling you things they didn't intend to tell you. So that was a question on listening. How do you think we should approach negotiation? do we go in firm and ask for a negotiation? Do we build things up? I think if you can build things up, I mean, my second principle in terms of getting to know people, building that relationship certainly helps. If you go into a negotiation cold, it's a bit harder. So using Cathy Ashton as an example, she tried to avoid going to a negotiation cold. So she always tried to go out for dinner with the Iranian delegation before the negotiation the next day. They didn't necessarily talk about the negotiation, but to be able to start a negotiation by saying, thank you so much for dinner last night, or I so much enjoyed dinner, just really helps get it get it off to a good start and get the momentum going. Owen, did you want to add any others? I'm just kind of going
well,
through.
I'm just thinking of the last one here, Oluwakemi. Apologies if I've mispronounced that. I think that don't feel guilty about pushing more within the organization. You may be being treated fine where you are, but you also want to progress up the ladder within the organization and to develop your career. And that's an absolutely appropriate thing. Have a look around, ask yourself, would a man be feeling guilty about this, or would they be sort of saying, actually, what is it that I want to achieve? And I would just encourage people to have ambition and push for that. Now, I don't think that tends to be a gender difference. The research evidence that we have, particularly, for example, of MBA students, shows no differences in ambition levels. Okay, maybe a selected group, but there are no differences in ambition levels. But there are some differences that come in behaviors for fear of the reaction from others. And that's a lot, of course, what Paul has been talking about and the importance of that.
Thanks, Owen. A question from Elizabeth, quite a tough one. How do you negotiate with politicians who are much more experienced? I think you need to, well, firstly, it's important not to go in feeling that you are powerless, because you're in the negotiation. They're there for a reason, as in they want something from you. And so it's important not to, just because you feel like you don't have the power, it becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Power is always about perception. And I think it's also important to understand the patterns of influence. Who's influencing the politicians? Who are they listening to? We talk about the whole kind of negotiation ecosystem. Who influences whom? So sometimes some people away from the table can be every bit as important as people are at the table as well. Lots of questions just going through. I'm afraid we're not
just having a look at one from Sophie from earlier, which builds on what you've just said, Paul, about the age and stage of the career. I think the bottom line is that Paul's just mentioned power, and perceptions of power do make a difference, and because they affect how people react. People react differently to more powerful people than to less powerful people. So in negotiations, if you're perceived as powerful, then you get a different reaction, you get different outcomes. As people become more senior in the organization, the power label tends to sort of dominate over and above sort of gender or other factors. So that it is definitely, things are not sort of necessarily stable at different moments within a career.
Just looking at Harriet's question, have you any advice when negotiating with people who aren't the ultimate decision maker over salaries? I mean, I think I would point to my comment about writing your counterpart's victory speech. So presumably the person you're negotiating with, your manager, obviously needs to negotiate with their board to secure your salary. So try to give them as many reasons and justifications as possible to take to their board to try and get you the salary I'm sure you rightly deserve. So great. It's, I mean, a great. I don't know, Owen, is there any other final questions you'd like?
I mean, there are a lot of interesting questions. I'm conscious that we do have to. Christine's going to tell us off if we don't hand over to her at the moment. So I'm happy to pick up further questions if people want on LinkedIn or my email. If people would like to, communicate, following this, then very, very happy to do so. Share thoughts. Alternatively, I'll do, I'd be delighted to see any of you on the Oxford Programme on Negotiation, or of course the Women Transforming Leadership Programme, and engage in these conversations further.
Yeah, absolutely. You have our LinkedIn details. Very happy to take any questions, and maybe we'll try and collect some of the questions together and send a kind of a review summary of the session, which hopefully will be helpful to you. I mean, I'd just like to finish before handing over to Christine by saying, I really do feel that when it comes to career advancement, tackling the gender pay gap, securing flexible hours, challenging stereotypes, leading teams, negotiation, if utilized effectively, can be a really, really powerful tool for women to overcome any systemic challenges, but at the same time achieve better outcomes both personally and professionally. But Christine, over to you, and I'll put the slide up so you have details on our two programs.
Thank you so much, Paul and Owen. Those are really great presentations, and I'm really glad that everyone in our audience resonates with the learnings that have been just imparted by our amazing speakers, Paul and Owen. They are our directors for our Oxford Programme on Negotiation, which I will be speaking about in just a moment. But it's really, really great that you've joined us today, and thank you for being so engaged. We love listening or reading your chat, and excellent questions as well. So I've dropped some links on the chat that includes my LinkedIn, also Paul and Owen's LinkedIn. If you want to connect with us, we can engage further. I've also dropped a link for our Oxford Programme on Negotiation and the Women Transforming Leadership, which I think are very, very relevant to our conversation today. So let me talk about a little bit about the Oxford Programme on Negotiation. You have a QR code here on the screen as well. If you have your phone, you can scan the code and you can check the details of the program later. So the program on negotiation has been running in the Oxford University for many, many years. It's one of our most successful programs and very established programs. We've had hundreds of, if not actually thousands now, because it's been running for 20 years. And it's designed to equip professionals and leaders with the tools and strategies to excel in high-stakes negotiations, whether that's in business, in diplomacy, or personal interactions. I think you might have remembered Paul mentioning about Baroness Cathy Ashton, who is a female leader, and she is one of our excellent speakers on the program. You will be hearing about high-stakes negotiations from her on the program. This program is hosted by my team, the executive team in the Said Business School, and it's of the University of Oxford, and it's taught by Owen and Paul, who you've just met today, and also a number of amazing faculty in both the Said Business School and also different practitioners in the field. We also have Sue Williams, another excellent female speaker, who is an excellent hostage negotiator. So that's kind of an exciting take on negotiation, which I'm sure you'll be very interested in learning about. So the program is very immersive. You'll be glad to know that this program combines both theories and also practical applications. If you decide to join us, you'll be learning the basics of negotiation, and we'll take you all the way through to high-level, multi-party, complex negotiations all the way to the last day. So every single day we add layers of complexity, from two-party negotiations, single issue, and we add layers of complexity until you're negotiating multiple different issues, multiple stakeholders, and complex issues as well. I think I've already shared a link to our testimonials about the program, and it's great to hear from our past participants who have been with us, and how this program helped them and how much they've learned on the program. I'll just drop that in the chat again. So this program is happening in exactly a month from now. So it starts on the 3rd of November, and it's a 5-day program. Begins on Monday, ends on Friday. Hotel check-ins are on the 3rd of November, the Sunday, and it's going to be very immersive. You get a chance to practice role plays, get involved in simulation, so you can actually negotiate these complex issues and build your confidence in a safe environment. So that's the Oxford Program on Negotiation. And now I'll speak a little bit about the Women Transforming Leadership. This is one of our most established programs for senior leaders, and this is designed specifically for women. This is actually the very first one of its kind in the world, and we've just celebrated our 10th anniversary not long ago, in late last year. And this is for some of you who've made a comment about not being confident enough to step up in your environment. A lot of women work in male-dominated industries. This is a program that would really help you. So this is a program that will help you lead with confidence and authenticity, whatever it is that you're doing in your organization. So you'll be hearing from top-tier faculty, from a diverse cohort of women leaders from all over the world. You'll be diving into topics like strategic decision-making, personal branding, and also the nuances of complex business landscape. So there was a comment as well about women not supporting each other in the workplace. This program will definitely help you learn how to build relationship and engage with your women peers in your organization. So this program is actually running next week, so it'll be too late perhaps to join that, but this is also running in March next year, and you'll see all the details on the links that I've provided. So if you would like to learn more about these programs, we'll be really happy to speak with you. I'm the senior program consultant of the Oxford Program in Negotiation, and I have also worked on the Women Transforming Leadership. I'll be happy to answer your questions, and would be really keen to have you and welcome you in Oxford. There's still time to join us for the Oxford Program on Negotiation. Please hurry up though, because we'll be closing the application soon, given that it starts next month. So if this resonates with you, please get in touch with me as soon as possible, or just apply on the link that I've provided here in the chat, and we'd be glad to see you there. And that's all for me. Thank you so
Great.
much.
Well, thank you so much, Christine. And thank you again, everybody again, for your great contributions. The chat is brilliant. I'm going to have to save that. So lots of really fascinating insights there. And I wish you, I mean, on behalf of me and Owen, I wish you all the very best in your future negotiations, and I hope we'll get to see you in Oxford at some stage.